The first thing I noticed was her silence. Rachel had always been chatty, filling the room with anecdotes about her day or random musings about life. But over the past few months, those conversations had dwindled to monosyllabic responses, forced smiles, and an air of indifference that stung more than any words could. At first, I told myself it was stress. Her job had always been demanding, and with 2 kids, life could feel like a never-ending cycle of responsibilities. But deep down, I knew something else was at play. It started small. Missed family dinners. A quick glance at her phone, followed by a sly smile. An increase in the nights she stayed late at work, brushing off my questions with excuses that didn't quite add up. Big project, she'd say, or team deadlines. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But when Emily, our 10-year-old, asked me one night why Mommy didn't tuck her in anymore, I felt a pang of guilt for not confronting the growing distance between us sooner. The mornings were the hardest. Rachel would leave before I woke up, her perfume lingering faintly in the air, a reminder that she had become a ghost in our marriage. I'd sit with Emily and Lucas at the breakfast table, forcing a smile as I helped them with their cereal or talked about their day ahead. But the unspoken questions in their eyes haunted me. They could feel it too, the shift in the atmosphere, the weight of her absence. One evening, after the kids were in bed, I tried to bridge the gap. Rachel was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone with a look of amusement that I hadn't seen in months. I sat beside her, careful not to startle her. "How was work today?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. "Fine," she replied, not looking up from her screen. I waited for her to elaborate, but the silence stretched on. "You've been working a lot lately," I said, treading carefully. "Is everything okay?" Her fingers paused mid-scroll, and she finally met my gaze. "Why wouldn't it be?" I shrugged, masking my frustration. "It just feels like you're distant, like something's changed." Her expression hardened. "Nothing's changed, Caleb. You're overthinking." And just like that, the conversation was over. She stood, muttering something about needing to check emails, and disappeared into the bedroom, leaving me alone with the hum of the refrigerator and the ache in my chest. As the weeks passed, the distance between us grew into a chasm. Rachel became more secretive, always guarding her phone or laughing at messages she refused to explain. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself I was imagining things. But every instinct I had screamed otherwise. The final blow came during one of Lucas's soccer games. He was only 7, but he played with a determination that made me beam with pride. Rachel, however, barely glanced up from her phone. When Lucas scored his first goal, he looked to the stands, his face lighting up as he searched for his mom's applause. But Rachel was too engrossed in whatever she was texting to notice. That night, as I tucked Lucas into bed, he asked me, "Why doesn't Mommy come to my games anymore?" I felt my throat tighten. "She's busy with work, buddy," I said, hating the lie even as it left my mouth. He nodded, but his disappointment was palpable. "You saw my goal, though, right, Dad?" I smiled, ruffling his hair. "Of course I did. You were amazing out there." As I closed his bedroom door, I leaned against it, exhaling slowly. Something had to change. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. Not for my sake, and certainly not for Emily and Lucas. They deserved better than this version of their mother, a version who was physically present but emotionally absent. For the first time in years, I felt truly alone in my marriage. The woman I had built a life with, the mother of my children, was slipping away from me, and I didn't know how to stop it. But one thing was certain. I wasn't going to let her neglect our family without a fight. The moment I heard his name, I felt a twinge in my gut, a warning, subtle but insistent. "Ryan." She mentioned him casually at first, describing him as a funny guy at work who was always full of ideas. But the way her eyes lit up when she said his name felt off. I told myself I was reading too much into it, that I was letting my insecurities cloud my judgment. But the warning persisted. It didn't take long for Ryan to become a regular presence in Rachel's conversations. Every story she told seemed to involve him. He had suggested a new strategy at work. He had shared a hilarious joke during a meeting. He had helped her fix her computer. Each mention chipped away at my patience, but I kept quiet, hoping it was just a phase. Then one evening, Rachel dropped a bombshell. "Ryan might stop by tomorrow," she said as we were getting ready for bed. I froze, my toothbrush halfway to my mouth. "Why?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. She shrugged, not meeting my eyes. "He's helping me with a project. It's easier to work from here than the office." I set the toothbrush down and turned to face her. "Do you think that's appropriate? Inviting him here, to our home?" Rachel sighed, rolling her eyes. "It's just work, Caleb. Don't make it a big deal." But it was a big deal. And the next day, when Ryan arrived, his presence felt like an intrusion in every sense of the word. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and radiated arrogance. He greeted Rachel with a wide smile, barely acknowledging me as I stood in the kitchen. The kids were in the living room, playing a board game, and I could feel their confusion at having a stranger in the house. Ryan made himself comfortable, sprawling on the couch like he owned the place. His laugh was loud, his demeanor cocky. He addressed me only when necessary, and even then, it was with a dismissive tone that set my teeth on edge. At one point, Emily wandered into the room, clutching her favorite stuffed animal. "Who's that, Mommy?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain. Rachel glanced at Ryan, then back at Emily. "This is my friend Ryan," she said, her tone overly cheerful. "He's helping Mommy with work." I saw the way Emily's brow furrowed, the way she clutched her stuffed animal tighter. She was only 10, but she wasn't naive. Neither was I. Ryan's visits became more frequent after that. He started showing up unannounced, his presence an unwelcome shadow over our family. Rachel defended him at every turn, brushing off my concerns as jealousy or insecurity. "He's just a friend," she'd say. "You're reading too much into it." But I wasn't. The tension in the house was palpable, and the kids felt it too. Lucas, normally chatty and full of energy, grew quieter whenever Ryan was around. Emily, ever observant, started asking pointed questions. "Why is Ryan here so much? Doesn't he have his own family?" I didn't have an answer for her, but I knew one thing. I had to protect my children from whatever was happening. One Saturday afternoon, as Ryan sat in the backyard with Rachel, laughing at some joke I didn't care to understand, I called Emily and Lucas into the kitchen. "How about we go to the park?" I suggested, keeping my voice light. Emily's face lit up. "Can we get ice cream too?" "Absolutely," I said, grabbing my keys. As we drove away, leaving Rachel and Ryan behind, I felt a mix of relief and guilt. I shouldn't have to whisk my kids away from their own home, just to shield them from the discomfort of watching their mother entertain another man. But for now, it was the best I could do. That night, after the kids were asleep, I confronted Rachel. "Why are you letting him come here so often?" I asked, my voice steady but firm. She didn't even look up from her phone. "Because he's helping me, Caleb. Why do you always have to make everything an issue?" "Because this is my home," I said, my voice rising, "and I won't let some arrogant stranger invade it." Rachel finally looked at me, her eyes cold. "If it bothers you that much, leave," she said, her tone dripping with indifference. Her words hit me like a slap. I stared at her, waiting for some sign of regret, some acknowledgement that she had crossed a line. But there was nothing, just that icy stare. For the first time, I realized just how far apart we had drifted, and how little she seemed to care. As I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, I made a silent vow. I wouldn't let Ryan or Rachel's choices destroy what mattered most: my children's sense of security. No matter what it took, I would protect them from the chaos that was slowly consuming our family. I should have known Ryan wouldn't stay confined to our home. His arrogance seemed to spill over into every corner of our lives, and soon, he started popping up in public spaces where I least expected him. Each appearance felt like an unspoken challenge, a deliberate move to assert his dominance in my family's world. The park incident was the final straw. It was a sunny Saturday, the kind of day perfect for a family outing. Emily and Lucas had been looking forward to it all week. The plan was simple: a picnic, some soccer, and a chance to escape the tension that had taken root at home. For a few hours, I wanted us to feel normal again. I spread the blanket on a grassy spot near the playground while the kids ran off to play. Their laughter filled the air, a sound I hadn't heard enough of lately. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of calm, a reminder of what life could be like without Ryan looming over us. But peace has a way of being fleeting when arrogance is involved. As I set out sandwiches and juice boxes, a voice I had grown to despise shattered the tranquility. Well, what do we have here? A family outing without inviting me? I turned to see Ryan strolling toward us, his signature smug grin plastered across his face. He wore sunglasses and carried an air of entitlement that made my blood boil. Behind him was Rachel, her expression unreadable as she trailed slightly behind. Ryan, I said through gritted teeth, keeping my tone neutral for the kid's sake. What are you doing here? He shrugged, spreading his arms as if the park belonged to him. Rachel mentioned you guys would be here. Thought I'd drop by and say hello. My fists clenched at my sides, but I forced myself to remain calm. Emily and Lucas had noticed Ryan's arrival and were making their way back to the picnic blanket, their playful smiles replaced by confusion. Daddy, why is Ryan here? Lucas asked, his voice small. I crouched to his level, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. I'm not sure, buddy, but don't worry, I'm here. Ryan, oblivious to, or perhaps reveling in, the discomfort he was causing, plopped down on the edge of the blanket and grabbed a juice box. You don't mind if I join, do you, Caleb? After all, it's good for the kids to see us all getting along. The audacity of his words made my jaw tighten. He spoke as if he was part of this family, as if his presence was somehow beneficial. I glanced at Rachel, hoping she'd intervene, but she avoided my gaze, busying herself with her phone. Emily sat beside me, her body language tense. She leaned in close and whispered, I don't like him, Daddy. I squeezed her hand, my heart aching at her words. It's okay, Emily. I've got this. But inside, I was seething. Ryan's constant intrusions were bad enough at home, but now he was invading our public spaces, forcing himself into moments meant for my children and me. And Rachel? She stood by, complicit in his arrogance, her silence as damaging as his words. As the kids tried to resume their play, Ryan's overbearing nature became even more evident. He followed Lucas to the soccer field, loudly coaching him and critiquing his moves, all while ignoring my presence. Emily stayed close to me, her wariness toward Ryan growing with each interaction. By the time we packed up to leave, the tension was unbearable. As I loaded the kids into the car, Ryan called out, See you around, Caleb. Maybe next time, try smiling more. It's good for the kids. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My anger was simmering just below the surface, and I didn't trust myself to keep it contained. The drive home was quiet, the kids unusually subdued. Their confusion and discomfort were palpable, and it broke my heart to see how much Ryan's presence was affecting them. That night, after the kids were in bed, I confronted Rachel once again. This has to stop, I said, my voice firm but controlled. Ryan has no business being around our family. She looked up from her phone, her expression indifferent. You're overreacting, Caleb. The kids are fine. They're not fine. I snapped, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. They're uncomfortable. They're confused. And so am I. What are you even doing, Rachel? She sighed, exasperated. If you can't handle it, maybe you're the one who shouldn't be here. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I stared at her, searching for any sign of remorse, but her gaze was cold and unyielding. At that moment, I realized I was on my own in this fight. Rachel had chosen her side, and it wasn't ours. As I lay awake that night, I replayed the day's events in my mind. Ryan had crossed too many lines, and Rachel had allowed it. I couldn't let this continue, not for my sake, but for Emily and Lucas. They deserved better, and I was going to make sure they got it. The backyard barbecue was supposed to be a light-hearted, family-friendly event, something to ease the growing tension and remind Emily and Lucas of happier times. I had spent the morning prepping, marinating chicken, slicing vegetables, and setting up the grill. I wanted it to be a day they'd enjoy, a brief escape from the chaos that had become our reality. But the moment Ryan walked through the back gate, uninvited as usual, I knew my plans were doomed. He strolled in like he owned the place, carrying a six-pack of beer and flashing that smug grin I'd grown to loathe. Rachel trailed behind him, laughing at something he'd said. She didn't even acknowledge me as I stood by the grill, tongs in hand, watching my world unravel one uninvited guest at a time. "Nice setup, Caleb," Ryan said, slapping me on the back as if we were old friends. "Glad to see you're putting in some effort." I clenched my jaw, resisting the urge to throw the tongs aside and shove him out of my yard. "What are you doing here, Ryan?" I asked, my voice tight. "Rachel invited me," he replied, his tone casual, as if that explained everything. "Figured I'd come by and see how the other half lives." Emily and Lucas were playing on the swing set, their laughter fading as they noticed Ryan's presence. Lucas clung to the swing chains, staring at him with a mix of confusion and apprehension. Emily looked at me, her eyes silently asking, "Why is he here?" I forced a smile for their sake. "Go on, kids. Keep playing. Daddy's got the grill covered." Ryan made himself at home, grabbing a beer and plopping into one of the lawn chairs I had set up. He dominated the conversation, talking over me and interrupting anyone who tried to contribute. Rachel laughed at his jokes, her gaze flitting between him and her phone, leaving me to feel like a spectator in my own home. But then, as if mocking me wasn't enough, Ryan decided to escalate things. It happened while I was grilling. Emily and Lucas had joined us at the table, nibbling on chips and asking when the food would be ready. Ryan sauntered over, grabbed a handful of chips, and started tossing them into his mouth like he was doing us a favor by being there. "Caleb," he said loudly, grabbing everyone's attention, "you know, you're really not bad at this whole backyard chef thing. Maybe that's your calling, hosting parties while real men handle the important stuff." I froze, the heat from the grill searing my face. "What's that supposed to mean?" I asked, turning to face him. He shrugged, taking another swig of his beer. "Nothing. Just saying you've got a knack for this. You should stick to what you're good at." Rachel snickered, and my stomach churned. Emily and Lucas exchanged nervous glances, their small shoulders hunched as if trying to make themselves invisible. And then Ryan crossed the line. He grabbed the bowl of macaroni salad I had prepared earlier and, with a theatrical flourish, dumped it on my head. The cold, sticky mess slid down my face and onto my shirt as Ryan burst into laughter. "Guess I was wrong," he said, smirking. "You're not even good at this." The yard fell silent. Emily gasped, her small hand flying to her mouth. Lucas's eyes filled with tears, and he clung to Emily's arm, whispering, "Why did he do that to Daddy?" Rachel didn't say a word. She just sat there, her face a mask of indifference, as if watching her husband be humiliated in front of their children was nothing out of the ordinary. I wiped the macaroni from my face, my hands trembling with rage. But instead of reacting, I took a deep breath and stepped away from the grill. The kids were watching, their eyes wide with fear and confusion, and I couldn't let them see me lose control. "Get out," I said, my voice low but firm. Ryan raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "Oh, come on, Caleb. Don't be such a sore loser." I said, "Get out," I repeated louder this time. My hands were balled into fists at my sides, but I refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing me snap. "Or what?" Ryan taunted, stepping closer. "You'll cry about it?" Emily's voice broke the tension. "Daddy, are you okay?" I turned to her, forcing a smile. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Go inside with your brother. I'll be there soon." She hesitated, but I gave her a reassuring nod. "Go on. Everything's okay." Once they were inside, I faced Ryan again. "You've had your fun. Now leave. And don't come back." He laughed, a deep, mocking sound that made my blood boil. "Sure thing, Caleb. But let's be honest. You're the one who doesn't belong here." As he turned to leave, Rachel followed him without so much as a glance in my direction. I stood in the yard, covered in macaroni salad, my dignity in shreds. But as I watched them walk away, I made a silent vow. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The humiliation from that barbecue stuck with me like a bad scar. Every time I looked at Emily and Lucas, I saw the confusion and fear in their eyes that day. My children had witnessed their father reduced to nothing in his own home by a man who had no right to be there. I couldn't let that stand. Not for them, and not for me. Rachel's indifference only made it worse. She acted as if nothing had happened, as if her silence during Ryan's outrageous behavior was justified. The morning after, I tried to talk to her, hoping to reach whatever shred of the woman I had fallen in love with still existed. "Rachel, we need to talk," I said as she poured herself a cup of coffee. She didn't even look up. "About what?" "About last night," I replied, my voice steady but firm. "About Ryan. About what the kids saw." She finally looked at me, her face a mask of boredom. "What about it?" My chest tightened. "What about it?" "Rachel, he humiliated me in front of our kids. He poured food on me and called me weak. And you just sat there." She shrugged, taking a sip of her coffee. "You're overreacting. Ryan was just joking around." "Joking?" My voice rose despite my best efforts to stay calm. "That wasn't a joke, Rachel. That was disrespectful, plain and simple. And you let it happen." She sighed, setting her mug down with a clink. "Maybe if you weren't so uptight all the time, things wouldn't escalate like that." I stared at her, disbelief coursing through me. "You're blaming me for this?" "I'm saying you're making a big deal out of nothing," she said, her tone dismissive. "If you're so bothered, maybe you should stop inviting him to these things." I felt a cold wave of realization wash over me. She wasn't just indifferent, she was complicit. She had chosen Ryan over her husband, over her family. And for the first time, I understood that this wasn't something we could talk through. This wasn't a misunderstanding that could be resolved with patience or compromise. This was war. Over the next few days, I focused on one thing: my kids. I spent as much time as I could with Emily and Lucas, taking them to the park, helping them with homework, reading them bedtime stories. I wanted them to feel loved, to feel safe, even as the foundation of our family was crumbling. But every moment with them was a painful reminder of what I was fighting for, and what I stood to lose if I didn't act. I couldn't let Ryan continue to poison our lives. I couldn't let Rachel's betrayal dictate the kind of father I was. One evening, after tucking the kids into bed, I stood in front of the mirror in the bathroom. My reflection stared back at me, weary and worn. I barely recognized the man I had become, beaten down, humiliated, powerless. But that wasn't who I was. Not really. Deep down, I knew there was strength in me, a fire that had been smothered but never extinguished, and it was time to let it burn. I started preparing myself, physically and mentally. I hit the gym early in the mornings, using the anger and frustration as fuel. I reached out to old friends for advice and support, people who reminded me of who I was before Rachel's betrayal had taken its toll. I even started journaling, pouring my thoughts onto paper as a way to process the chaos around me. And through it all, one thought kept me going. I would show Ryan and Rachel that I wasn't weak. I wasn't a man who could be pushed around and disrespected. I was a father, a protector, and I would fight for my children's future. The opportunity to confront Ryan came sooner than I expected. A week after the barbecue, Rachel announced that Ryan would be coming over to help her with some work stuff. "No, he's not," I said, my voice firm. Rachel raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," I said, stepping closer. "Ryan's not welcome in this house anymore." She laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "You don't get to decide that, Caleb." I met her gaze, unflinching. "Yes, I do. Because this is my home. These are my kids. And I won't let him disrespect me, or them again." She rolled her eyes, but I saw the flicker of uncertainty in her expression. For the first time in months, I felt like I had taken back a small piece of control. It wasn't enough, but it was a start. I didn't know how the confrontation with Ryan would go, but I knew one thing. I was ready. Ready to defend my family, my dignity, and my role as a father. Ryan had pushed me too far, and now it was my turn to push back. The evening of the confrontation arrived faster than I anticipated. Ryan wasn't one to back down, and when Rachel told him he was no longer welcome in our home, he naturally decided to show up anyway. His arrogance was predictable, his audacity expected. What he didn't expect, however, was that I was ready for him. It was a quiet evening. Emily and Lucas were upstairs playing, their laughter echoing faintly through the house. I was in the living room, pretending to focus on a book, but my mind was elsewhere. I was bracing myself for what I knew was coming. Sure enough, The sound of the doorbell cut through the quiet, sharp and unwelcome. Rachel was already heading to the door, her phone in hand, when I stopped her. "I'll get it," I said, my voice calm but firm. She hesitated, narrowing her eyes. "Caleb, don't." I said. "I'll get it," I repeated, not waiting for her reply. When I opened the door, there he was, Ryan, standing there with his ever-present smirk, hands stuffed into his pockets like he didn't have a care in the world. "Evening, Caleb," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Rachel said you might have an issue with me stopping by." I stepped outside, closing the door behind me. The night air was cool, but the tension between us was electric. "You're not welcome here, Ryan," I said evenly. "I thought I made that clear." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Come on, man. Don't take this so personally. Rachel and I—" "Stop." I cut him off, my voice rising. "You don't get to say her name like that. You don't get to act like you belong here, like this is your family. It's not. And you're done inserting yourself into our lives." His smirk faltered for a moment before returning, more taunting than ever. "You're really worked up, aren't you? Must be hard knowing your wife prefers my company." That was it, the final straw. Before I knew it, my fist connected with his jaw, the satisfying thud reverberating through my body. Ryan staggered back, his hand flying to his face in shock. "What the hell, Caleb?" he spat, blood dripping from his lip. "You think you can just walk into my house, my family, and disrespect me in front of my kids?" I advanced on him, my anger boiling over. "You think I'm just going to let you humiliate me? Humiliate them?" Ryan tried to recover, straightening up and raising his hands defensively. "Calm down, man. You're making a scene." "A scene?" I laughed bitterly. "You made this a scene when you poured macaroni on my face, when you undermined me in front of my kids, when you thought you could take over my life." By now, Rachel had come to the door, her face pale as she watched the unfolding chaos. "Caleb, stop," she yelled, but her voice barely registered. Ryan tried to push past me, heading for the door. "I'm done with this," he muttered, but I wasn't letting him off that easily. I grabbed his arm, forcing him to face me. "No, you're not done. You're going to apologize, to me, to Rachel, and to my kids. And then you're going to leave. For good." He yanked his arm away, sneering. "You're pathetic, Caleb. You're not a man. You're a joke." That's when I snapped. I grabbed him by the collar and slammed him against the side of the house. "You want to see what kind of man I am?" I growled, my voice low and dangerous. "Because I'm done playing nice." Ryan's bravado crumbled in an instant. He stammered something unintelligible, his eyes wide with fear. I released him, letting him stumble to the ground. "Get out of here," I said, my voice cold, "and don't ever come back." He scrambled to his feet, casting one last look at Rachel before hurrying to his car. The sound of the engine roaring to life and fading into the distance was the most satisfying thing I'd heard in weeks. Rachel stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "Yes, I did," I replied, meeting her gaze. "Because you weren't going to." She opened her mouth to respond but said nothing. Instead, she turned and walked back inside, leaving me alone on the porch. The adrenaline coursing through me slowly faded, replaced by a heavy sense of finality. Ryan was gone, but the damage he had caused remained. I had stood up for myself, for my children, but now I had to face the reality of what came next. Rachel's silence spoke volumes, and I knew that whatever connection we once had was irreparably broken. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. The house felt quiet, almost too quiet. Emily and Lucas peeked down from the staircase, their wide eyes filled with questions they were too afraid to ask. I gave them a small, reassuring smile. "It's okay, kids. Everything's okay." But deep down, I knew this was just the beginning of the battle to reclaim my family and my dignity. The confrontation with Ryan felt like a release, a long overdue stand against the disrespect that had invaded my life. But the aftermath wasn't as clean as I'd hoped. That night, I barely slept, replaying the encounter over and over in my mind. The adrenaline had faded, replaced by a heavy, lingering weight. The fight wasn't over. Not with Ryan, and certainly not with Rachel. The next morning, I woke to find Rachel sitting at the kitchen table, her coffee untouched, her phone on the counter. Her expression was guarded, her lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't even look up when I walked in. "Morning," I said, my voice strained. "Morning," she replied flatly, not meeting my eyes. I poured myself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, studying her. For a moment, I thought about breaking the silence, about trying to have a real conversation. But what was there left to say? Ryan's smug face, his taunts, and Rachel's indifference had already said it all. The kids came down a few minutes later, their energy breaking the tension in the room. Emily and Lucas chatted about their plans for the day, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. I smiled, grateful for their innocence. They were the reason I was fighting so hard to hold everything together. But holding everything together meant facing the fallout head-on. By mid-morning, the phone call started. Ryan, unsurprisingly, had wasted no time playing the victim. He'd contacted the police, reporting the confrontation as an unprovoked assault. The officer on the other end of the line informed me that I might be facing charges, depending on how Ryan wanted to proceed. I hung up the phone, my stomach in knots. This was exactly what I'd feared, that standing up for myself would somehow make me the villain. But I refused to let Ryan's lies define me. I called my lawyer, explaining everything that had happened, from Ryan's provocation to Rachel's role in allowing him into our lives. "You did what any father would do," my lawyer said. "We'll fight this." Despite his reassurance, the tension in the house was palpable. Rachel avoided me for most of the day, retreating to the bedroom with her phone. I knew she was talking to Ryan, probably comforting him, playing the loyal partner while our marriage disintegrated around her. That evening, as I was tucking Emily and Lucas into bed, Rachel finally emerged. She stood in the doorway of Lucas's room, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "Can we talk?" she asked after the kids were asleep. I followed her to the living room, bracing myself for whatever excuse or justification she was about to offer. She sat on the edge of the couch, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the floor. "What you did last night," she began, her voice low. "It was unnecessary." I scoffed, leaning against the wall. "Unnecessary? He's been disrespecting me and this family for weeks, Rachel. He poured food on me in front of our kids. He called me weak. And you let him." Her head snapped up, her eyes flashing. "You think this is my fault? You invited him into our lives," I said, my voice rising. "You brought him into this house, let him around our children. You defended him every time I tried to set boundaries. So yeah, Rachel, this is your fault." She stood, her fists clenched at her sides. "Maybe if you weren't so controlling." "Controlling?" I interrupted, laughing bitterly. "Wanting respect in my own home is controlling? Protecting my kids from a toxic, arrogant man is controlling?" Her silence spoke volumes. She turned away, her shoulders tense, and for the first time, I saw it, the cracks in her armor, the guilt she'd been hiding behind deflection and anger. But guilt wasn't enough. Not anymore. "That man humiliated me, Rachel," I continued, my voice steady but firm, "in front of my children. And you let him. Do you have any idea what that does to a father? To a husband?" She didn't answer. She didn't have to. Her silence was the only answer I needed. That night, I packed a bag. I didn't tell her where I was going or when I'd be back. I just needed space. Space to think, to breathe, to figure out what the hell I was going to do next. Emily and Lucas were asleep, their innocent faces reminding me of what was at stake. I kissed them both on the forehead before leaving. As I drove to my brother's house, a sense of clarity began to settle over me. Ryan might have started this war, but Rachel had let it happen. And now, it was up to me to protect what mattered most, my children and my dignity. The reckoning wasn't over, but I was ready for whatever came next. The silence in the house after I left was deafening. At least, that's what I imagined it must have felt like for Rachel. For me, the drive to my brother David's house was oddly liberating. Every mile I put between myself and that toxic situation felt like a step closer to reclaiming my sanity. By the time I pulled into David's driveway, I was ready to take the next steps to rebuild. David opened the door before I could even knock, his face a mix of concern and understanding. He'd been my sounding board for weeks now, the one person who had been honest enough to tell me that things weren't going to get better unless I took action. "It's about time," he said simply, pulling me into a quick hug. "Come in. You've got a lot to figure out." Inside, the warmth of his home was a stark contrast to the coldness I'd left behind. David's wife, Clara, welcomed me with open arms, immediately offering me the guest room and a hot meal. They didn't pry, didn't push for details, they just gave me space to breathe. That first night, as I lay awake in the guest bed, my mind raced with questions and doubts. Had I done the right thing by leaving? Was I abandoning Emily and Lucas, or was I protecting them? Would Rachel even care that I was gone, or had she already written me off completely? The weight of it all pressed down on me, but somewhere beneath the doubt was a glimmer of clarity. I knew I couldn't go back, not to the way things were. The next morning, I called my lawyer. "Caleb, this is the right move," she said after I explained the situation. "Leaving the house doesn't mean you're giving up custody. It shows you're taking a stand against a toxic environment. Now, let's focus on securing your rights." We started the paperwork for a custody agreement and the preliminary steps for filing for divorce. The thought of officially ending my marriage was sobering, but it also felt like the first real step toward reclaiming my life. Meanwhile, Rachel tried to contact me. Her texts alternated between anger and desperation. One moment, she was accusing me of overreacting. "You left over a little argument? How childish." The next, she was pleading, "We can fix this, Caleb. Just come home, and we'll talk." I didn't respond, not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I knew my words would fall on deaf ears. Rachel wasn't sorry, not for her actions, not for her choices. She was sorry for the consequences. Emily and Lucas were my priority now. I arranged to pick them up from school that afternoon, wanting to shield them from the chaos at home. When they saw me waiting by the car, their faces lit up, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I was doing something right. "Daddy!" Lucas shouted, running into my arms. Emily followed, quieter but no less relieved. "Are we going to stay with you?" she asked, her big, searching eyes locking onto mine. "For a little while, sweetheart," I said, hugging them both tightly. "We're going to spend some time with Uncle David and Aunt Clara. Is that okay?" They nodded, and I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Their trust in me, their belief that I could protect them. It was all the motivation I needed. Over the next few days, I focused on creating a sense of normalcy for them. We had dinner together every night, played board games, and even started a small garden in David's backyard. It wasn't much, but it was ours. Rachel, meanwhile, continued her campaign to bring me back. She sent voice messages, emails, even tried calling David to get through to me. But I stood firm. Her words were empty without actions to back them up, and I wasn't interested in apologies that came from convenience rather than genuine regret. Ryan, of course, was silent. I suspected he was licking his wounds, both physical and metaphorical. My lawyer assured me that the police inquiry into our altercation wouldn't go far, given the witnesses who had seen him provoke me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't done causing trouble. One evening, as I tucked Emily and Lucas into bed, Emily looked up at me and asked, "Are we going to stay here forever, Daddy?" I knelt beside her, smoothing her hair back. "Maybe not here, sweetheart, but wherever we go, it'll be somewhere safe, somewhere happy." "Without Ryan?" Lucas added, his voice small. "Without Ryan," I confirmed, my chest tightening at the thought of how much they'd endured. That night, as I sat on the porch with David, I felt a sense of resolve solidify within me. Leaving had been the hardest decision I'd ever made, but it was also the right one. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was moving towards something better, not just for me, but for my children. The days turned into weeks, and while life at David and Clara's house was far from perfect, it was exactly what Emily, Lucas, and I needed, a safe haven. Slowly but surely, I began to piece my life back together, starting with my children. They deserved stability, love, and a father who could be fully present, no matter how broken I might have felt inside. My first priority was rebuilding their trust. I'd always prided myself on being a dependable father, but I knew the chaos of the past months had shaken their sense of security. They needed to see that I wasn't going anywhere, that no matter what happened with Rachel, they could count on me. It started with small gestures, consistent routines, bedtime stories, and being there to pick them up from school every single day. At first, they were hesitant, almost as if they were waiting for the other shoe to drop. But as the days passed, I saw the tension ease from their little shoulders. Emily started talking more, sharing her thoughts and worries. Lucas, who had been unusually quiet since the barbecue incident, began smiling again, his laughter a balm for my weary heart. Rachel, on the other hand, wasn't making things any easier. She was relentless, sending text after text, alternating between anger and desperation. "You're ruining this family, Caleb. Just come home so we can work this out. You're turning the kids against me." I didn't respond. Her words held no weight anymore. She had made her choices, and now she was living with the consequences. Instead, I focused on the legal battle ahead. My lawyer and I worked tirelessly to build a case for full custody. The evidence of Ryan's behavior, Rachel's complicity, and the instability they brought into the children's lives painted a clear picture. I wasn't trying to punish Rachel. I was trying to protect my kids. That distinction kept me grounded, even when the process felt overwhelming. Therapy became another cornerstone of our new life. At first, Emily and Lucas were hesitant to talk to a stranger about their feelings, but I knew they needed an outlet. We found a wonderful family therapist who specialized in helping children navigate difficult transitions. The sessions weren't easy. Hearing Emily ask why Mommy let Ryan treat me badly, or Lucas admitting he was scared Ryan would come back, broke my heart. But those moments were necessary. They were steps toward healing, no matter how painful. For me, therapy was a revelation. I had spent so much time suppressing my emotions, convincing myself I had to be strong for everyone else, that I hadn't realized how much anger and hurt I was carrying. Sitting in that chair, talking about everything I had endured, the humiliation, the betrayal, the feeling of being replaced in my own family, was like opening a floodgate. My therapist didn't judge or push. She simply listened, guiding me toward understanding that my worth wasn't tied to Rachel's choices or Ryan's taunts. As I worked on myself, I began to rediscover parts of me that I had neglected for years. I started running again, something I used to love but had given up as life got busier. Those early morning jogs became my sanctuary, a time to clear my mind and focus on the road ahead, both literally and figuratively. I also reconnected with old friends, people who reminded me of who I was before my marriage had turned toxic. Their support was invaluable, a reminder that I wasn't alone in this fight. Emily and Lucas began to thrive in the new environment. Emily joined a dance class, her confidence blossoming as she found joy in something that was hers alone. Lucas developed a fascination with drawing, spending hours creating colorful masterpieces that he proudly hung on the walls of David's house. Watching them find their footing gave me hope. They were resilient, stronger than I could have imagined. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching a movie, Emily turned to me and said, "Daddy, I like it here. It feels safe." Her words hit me like a tidal wave. For so long, I had felt like I was failing them, like I couldn't protect them from the chaos Rachel and Ryan had brought into our lives. But hearing her say that reassured me I was doing the right thing. I pulled her and Lucas close, kissing the tops of their heads. "It'll always be safe with me," I promised, and I meant it. As the court date for custody approached, I felt a sense of calm that had eluded me for months. I couldn't predict the outcome, but I knew I had done everything in my power to prove that I was the best person to provide a stable, loving home for my kids. Rachel still tried to manipulate the situation, claiming she had changed, that she regretted everything. But her words rang hollow, and even Emily and Lucas seemed reluctant to engage with her. They were old enough to understand, at least in part, what had happened. And while I never spoke ill of Rachel in front of them, they saw the truth for themselves. The future wasn't certain, but one thing was clear. I wasn't just rebuilding a life. I was building something stronger, something unbreakable. For me, for Emily, and for Lucas. The day of the custody hearing came and went in a blur. Months of preparation, sleepless nights, and relentless determination had brought me to this moment. When the judge ruled in my favor, granting me full custody of Emily and Lucas, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It wasn't just a legal victory. It was the affirmation that I had done the right thing for my kids, that my efforts to protect and provide for them had been recognized. Rachel sat silently in the courtroom, her once defiant demeanor replaced by something that almost resembled regret. But I didn't let myself dwell on her expression. This wasn't about her anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. Walking out of the courthouse with Emily and Lucas by my side, I felt a rare sense of peace. For the first time in years, the path ahead felt clear. There would still be challenges, of course, co-parenting with Rachel during her supervised visits, navigating the emotional scars left by the past. But we were free from the toxicity that had consumed our lives. That freedom was everything. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of adjustments. I found a cozy house not far from David's place, a fresh start for the three of us. Emily and Lucas were thrilled to pick out their own rooms, arguing over paint colors and decorations in the way only siblings can. Watching them laugh and bicker felt like a small miracle, a sign that they were beginning to heal. One evening, as I unpacked boxes in the living room, Emily approached me, holding a framed photo of the three of us from a happier time. "Can we put this up?" she asked, her voice hesitant. "Of course," I said, taking the frame from her. I found a spot on the mantel, placing it where it could be a reminder of our resilience. It wasn't just a memory, it was a symbol of how far we'd come. Life settled into a new rhythm. I threw myself into my work, finding fulfillment not just in my career, but in the stability it provided for Emily and Lucas. I also continued therapy, both for myself and as a family. It wasn't always easy, but the progress we made together was worth every tear and difficult conversation. Rachel's supervised visits were sporadic at first, her attempts to reconnect with the kids hampered by her own unresolved issues. I stayed civil, focusing on what was best for Emily and Lucas. They needed consistency, not more drama, and I was determined to give them that. As time passed, I began to rebuild my social life as well. I reconnected with old friends, joined a local running club, and even started volunteering at a community center. These small steps reminded me that I was more than the man Rachel and Ryan had tried to tear down. I was stronger now, more self-assured, and ready to embrace the future. One day, during a trip to the park, Lucas tugged on my hand. "Daddy, look, I made a new friend," he said, pointing to a boy his age playing on the swings. His friend's mom, a kind-looking woman with a warm smile, waved from a nearby bench. As the kids played, she introduced herself as Claire, a recent transplant to the area. We struck up a conversation, finding common ground in our shared experiences as single parents. There was an ease to our interaction, a refreshing contrast to the tension and conflict I had grown accustomed to. For the first time in a long time, I felt a spark of hope that I could build something new, something healthy, with someone who respected and valued me. Months turned into a year, and our lives continued to flourish. Emily excelled in her dance classes, earning a trophy at her first competition. Lucas's love for art blossomed into a talent that impressed even his teachers. Watching them grow and thrive filled me with a pride that no words could capture. On the anniversary of the custody ruling, I took Emily and Lucas back to the park where everything had fallen apart. This time, there was no Ryan, no Rachel, no lingering tension. Just us, laughing and playing in the crisp autumn air. As I sat on a bench, watching my kids chase each other across the grass, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. The journey had been brutal, but it had also shaped me into the man I was today, a stronger, wiser, and more compassionate father. Emily ran over, breathless and grinning. "Daddy, can we get ice cream on the way home?" "Of course," I said, scooping her up into a hug. Lucas joined us, his laughter ringing out as I ruffled his hair. In that moment, surrounded by their joy, I knew we were going to be okay. Our lives weren't perfect, but they were ours. And as I looked ahead to the future, I felt nothing but hope.